In one of your recent Facebook posts, I'm a fan, you touched on the idea of fairness, that some people always have it harder, and you discuss it as a sort of a thing worth thinking about sometimes. And one of the challenges that we face in conveying reality of war to those who are outside, especially who have not been through any of the sirens, through any of the explosions, is that they simply don't understand us. They don't understand what it is. And I was wondering how, in your opinion, again, from your experience as a writer, as a journalist, as the editor-in-chief in UkraineWorld, how do we bridge that gap? And what approaches can actually help to connect people experiencing war, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere, in Syria, in Georgia, with those who have never lived through it?
Very difficult question, because basically what you're asking is how to translate experience, and experience is untranslatable. So if you, for example, didn't live through the bombings, if you didn't live through these explosions, if you didn't lose a close friend or a family member, it's very difficult to explain how to do it, but how to feel it. But basically, humanity understood it very long time ago, and therefore I always saying that, look, read Aristotle to understand what is going on. Aristotle was saying, what is the purpose of drama? Like, why the hell you would go and see Aeschylus and Euripides and everything? And he was saying, okay, the purpose of drama is that to invite you to feel emotions that you don't necessarily feel in your daily life. We will give you the emotions on stage. You will go through them. And by going through the emotions that you do not necessarily feel, you kind of enlarge yourself. You expand to others. You become more empathic. And I think this is one of the major roles of culture. Culture is, okay, it's also about identity, it's about asking who you are, but it's also about, making these bridges between you and other people in a situation when experience is untranslatable. So culture is an impossible endeavour to translate the untranslatable. And, it's a very long problem of humanity and very long history how you do it. So I do think that the major element is through culture. I think that Ukrainians sometimes, and when I say Ukrainians, I say myself, and I felt this, So when I first went abroad, I to Paris, for example, I felt myself like to being in a matrix. Like, people are happy here, people are okay. So you talk to people, and for example, you are telling about your experience, and people say, "Oh, how interesting." So they kind of using words that shock you, because it's not interesting that you're on the brink of losing life, or that you lost your friend or whatever. But that's not their fault, and it's our task to find new ways to translate this experience, because it's like opening up a book written in a language that you don't know. And I always use this metaphor, emotions and understanding. It's about this ABC. It's about learning the alphabet. It's about learning the basics. And of course, you need a person which is open to that, which is willing to understand you, but you also need to make an effort, because this person is not necessarily in your position. And I think it's a long task, and this is what culture does.
Can I just follow up on this question? So, on the one hand, we're talking about translating these experiences, but on the other hand, war is still very deeply personal. So, the way I'm going through it is not the same as you or anyone else here is going through it. And one of the ways that is often present, again, in media is trying to explain things through the lens of, say, if I'm talking to Afghan person, through their lens. But again, since it's very personal, our traumas, they can actually clash, and sometimes it actually works the opposite way around. So it's harder for me to understand them because our experience of war is different. So the question I'm asking is, should we actually keep drawing these connections? Again, like trying to explain terms, concepts, experiences, or wars. Or is it more productive to speak about every single case separate and within its own terms and concepts?
That's a very good question. And I think there can be no straight answer. So if we like comparing it very mechanically, it's bad because each war is probably different. I haven't seen many wars, but in Ukraine there are lots of war reporters who have seen different wars and who can compare. Again, can they really compare? Because a war reporter always comes as an outsider, and he or she can always leave. And that's always kind of it's always a tricky thing to talk to a journalist that comes, or to be a journalist yourself, because life always gives us these situations where you, on the one hand, on this side of the barrier, and tomorrow you will be on another side. So I have both the experience of talking to reporters who kind of seemed like a little bit of war tourists, but I was also kind of felt like a war tourist when I was coming to the frontline cities and talking to soldiers or whatever. So it's always this very tricky thing. But I do think that from my experience, I can feel much more understanding from people who went through very, very harsh experience than from people who are not, and this is normal. I do think that we still need to talk a lot about Syria and Ukraine together, for example, and this is a time now to do that. I've just made a podcast with Raja Abdusalam, who has been working on war crimes in Syria, but now is part of the Reckoning Project, who is working on crimes in Ukraine. And one of the things why we should do that is that, for example, if we have one perpetrator who is similar, like in this case Russia, you can really see the patterns. And one of the things that, for example, he said, which was kind of I intuitively understood, of course, going into this war, understanding this war, but is that, look, Russians are using violence not for military purposes, but rather for power purposes. Like they're using violence to show that they are the boss. And this is violence when they're bombarding cities, and this is violence when they're shooting at civilian cars. This is violence when they're doing torture. And if you understand that violence for them is not a tool to even to exterminate the enemy, but a tool to assert the very sadistic domination, you kind of understand what kind of power they have in mind, because they don't have the conception of power as authority, for example. Like, I have power because, I don't know, I people just, listen to me, or they think that I'm wise or whatever. No, their conception of power is violence. The connection between these two is very, very important. And therefore, when you understand it, you understand differently how they will react and what to do with them, because in their mindset, the cruel person, and I also read it on Facebook 1 week ago, the cruel person, how you say it in English, I know the French word, le bourreau, the executioner, right? The person who cuts your head. So while in the Western European, Central European cultures, Eastern European, this executioner is always kind of a person who should be placed on the borders of the society, because he's not clean, and he's always dealing with death, and He lives outside of the city. He probably doesn't have wife or kids, whatever, because he's dealing with death. You better go away from him. So in the Russian society, you see that this executioner, the very violent figure, is in the center of the society, is the one who you consider to be a sovereign. And therefore, Putin knows that, and therefore he understands that the more people he will be able to kill, even his own people, the more people will kind of see at him, look at him with awe.
So the Oprechnik is a kind of hero, not someone on the outside. Something you said a minute ago, now I hadn't scripted this question, but I think it could be interesting. They say that generals always fight the last war, but journalists, to an extent, do they sort of cover an accumulation of their other wars? So when they come somewhere like Ukraine, they come with a hybrid set of previous experiences and narratives which they try to overlay, which may be completely inappropriate. Do you think that's true? And how would you go about countering it? Is it only individual stories grounded in reality that can reset that?
Look, journalists are different, so we cannot say about journalists in general. I have lots of good friends journalists. When I say this kind of a critical remarks, my friends journalists should also understand that I'm not talking about all the journalists. I think the journalists need to be very careful with people, very careful about this experience that people have, very careful about the country, because sometimes some people come with their set of ideas and their set of ideologies, and kind of a certain indoctrinated, like people saying, okay, nationalism is always bad. Nationalism is not always bad. Nationalism is bad when it is offensive, when it is imperialist, when it is violent, when nationalism is defensive, like when you have a big enemy and you need to consolidate your society. Nationalism is not bad. It's another tool to assert equality, because nationalism was born from the idea that, well, the rich and the poor, the women and the men, the kids and the adults are all part of the same organism. So initially nationalism in the early 19th century was primarily anti-tyrannical, republican, and there is still very, very big potential in that. But of course, there are problems with nation when it becomes bad, when it becomes radical, etc. And we need to understand what we are dealing with. Are we dealing with the phenomenon, or we are dealing with excess of this phenomenon?